Hello and welcome to WTO Forum. At the turn of the millennium, the 192 members of the United Nations set for themselves the goal of making our planet a better place. Through the 8 Millennium Development Goals, these 192 governments sought to eradicate poverty and hunger, improve education, enhance environmental sustainability, and improve the welfare of women and children by the year 2015. Trade has an important component in one of these 8 Millennium Development Goals, in that the members agreed to establish further a more open, transparent, rules-based, and fairly adjusted system of international trade. The question today is, how can trade and the World Trade Organization help achieve the Millennium Development Goals by 2015? We're very fortunate to have with us today 2 men who know a great deal about this topic. We have Festus Mogae, the former President of Botswana. Greetings. And we have Jeremy Hobbs, the Executive Director of Oxfam International. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
President Mogae, how can trade and the WTO help us achieve these important targets?
Oh, in a very important way, because one of the ways of fighting poverty is employment creation in developing countries. And employment creation is related to domestic production, not only for subsistence, but also for export. And fair trade, as envisaged by the rules of the WTO, World Trade Organization, would enable developing countries have access to markets of developed countries. That is a very important objective from the point of view of the developing countries, because it will help create employment and therefore generate income. For example, the American AGOA created hundreds of thousands of jobs by allowing African exporters access into the US market tariff-free. That's we consider it as Africans as one of the most important Africa-focused policies of the United States that was most helpful to us. We would like that to be on a generalized basis, have greater access to the markets of the developed countries. That would help us fight poverty and improve the conditions of living of our people. That is why we attach the greatest importance to the World Trade Organization and its rules, which are open, would be open and fair.
Jeremy?
Well, I agree entirely with the President, but I think we have to go further. And of course, the conclusion of a round of trade is very important for the reasons the President has spelled out. But we would argue that it has to be a development-friendly round. And even the 2008 framework that was agreed, we would say is not sufficiently development-friendly. It will not give enough market access to developing countries, particularly in areas where they're competing with rich countries on the same products. And we don't think enough has been done to challenge the continued levels of subsidization by the Europeans and the Americans in agriculture, which gives them an unfair advantage in domestic markets in developing countries. So we think there's still a lot of rebalancing to be done between rich and poor countries in the current framework. And of course, we're very worried that the current deal is going nowhere because of some members not being prepared to finalise that deal. So I guess we would say a deal concluded, yes, is absolutely critical to getting the kind of economic growth that the President referred to, but we should be giving far more, and particularly since 2008 we had such terrible economic changes, to be asking poor countries to give even more to conclude the deal seems quite unreasonable. The last thing I'd say is it's terribly important for multilateral negotiations, that is, negotiations between countries, that these talks succeed, because that will give an enormous boost of confidence in solving poverty through the UN process, climate change through the UN process.
Do you agree with Jeremy, Mr. President, that perhaps what's on the table right now in terms of negotiations is insufficient?
I couldn't agree more. This is a partnership of unequals. Therefore, due cognizance should be taken of the conditions of the least developed countries, and therefore special arrangements made to accommodate them. Fair trade, in fact, means precisely that you don't have heavyweights fighting with lightweights in the ring. You have to make appropriate arrangements, appropriate adjustments, appropriate accommodation for the developed countries, because it's in the interest of the international community to bring this up so that they will then compete on an equal basis. At present, they can't. And therefore, I agree very much with Jeremy that the development component must be taken into account.
How can that be achieved?
Well, to be blunt, I think the US has to give a bit more space and back off on some of its demands. I mean, it is the reason that we don't have a deal being concluded. The discussions around the WTO, most ambassadors would say that to you. But I also think other parties have unrealistic expectations of what can be given by poor countries in order to conclude a deal. And it does seem to me that this kind of coercive form of negotiation is inappropriate at a time when actually we need countries pulling together to solve the fact that Millennium Development Goal 1, which is about halving hunger, is nowhere near on track. In fact, since 2000, when the goals were actually declared, the number of people hungry as a percentage has gone down by 0.5%, from 14 to 13.5, but the actual number has increased. So there are more people going to bed hungry every night, and that reflects a lack of investment and commitment by both those national governments, but also the international community. And it's dealing with things like unfair subsidies, unfair tariff walls against developing countries.
You mentioned the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that the United States has extended, and there's currently a debate, Mr. President, about the merits of regional or bilateral agreements versus a multilateral agreement such as the Doha round. Do you think there are more advantages for developing countries through a multilateral process, as Jeremy has suggested?
Yes, certainly. A multilateral process takes account and tries to accommodate and reconcile divergent and even conflicting interests. It takes them into account, whereas bilateral arrangements are often inconsistent one with the other because they are also based purely on bargaining power. Now, bargaining power, of course, the stronger gets the better of the deal, because whereas the multilateral system is based on the principle of fairness. We say that it is unfair for the United States, for the European Union to expect, say, African countries to give as much as the other two superpowers can, because we can't. We don't have that capacity to do so. The irony of it is that some of the concessions or the special arrangements that we have asked for under the Doha round for our infant industries and for our monocultural economies is what the developed countries are themselves doing for their industries through, as Jeremy has mentioned, these bailouts and subsidies and special arrangements for their companies. Whereas when they do so, that has an impact on the rest of the world. It has a global impact. Whereas the concessions we are asking, given our relative size, has no harmful impact on anybody.
Jeremy Hobbs, final thoughts.
Well, I think it's a great shame that the WTO is stuck with the impasse between its member states, and obviously we need to encourage the Americans, the Europeans, and others to really come forward and try and unbreak the logjam. But I also think we're looking at a much broader situation with global governance failing us on a whole range of issues. And I do think if Doha could be concluded, as I say, in a very developmental friendly way, it would send such a strong signal throughout the rest of the global governance on issues like climate change and poverty that it would make an incredible difference.
President Mogae, you have the last word.
Well, he has said it all, and you have said it all. The multilateral system based on principles of fairness and openness is what is required, and due cognizance has been taken of the position of the weaker of the members of the international community. Because really, we speak of the WTO, the WTO. Who is the WTO? It's the international community itself, especially the leading members, including the new emerging bigger developing countries like China, India, Brazil, even South Africa.
Festus Mogae, Jeremy Hobbs, thank you both, and thanks to you for watching WTO Forum.